The morning mist clung to the Allegheny River like a shroud when Major George Washington's small force approached the French position at Fort Duquesne in 1754. The young Virginian, barely 22 years old, had no idea that his actions in the Pennsylvania wilderness would ignite a global conflict that would reshape the very fabric of colonial America. Washington's boots squelched in the muddy ground as he surveyed the hastily constructed fortification his men had named Fort Necessity, the circular wooden stockade built in a meadow surrounded by hills. Represented more than just a military outpost, it symbolized the growing tensions between European powers vying for control of North America's vast interior. The French had been expanding their influence southward from Canada, establishing a chain of forts along the Ohio River Valley. This strategic waterway represented the key to controlling trade with Native American tribes and access to the continent's heartland. For the British colonies, particularly Virginia, this French expansion threatened their own westward ambitions and the lucrative fur trade that sustained many frontier communities. As Washington's men prepared their defenses, they represented something unprecedented in colonial history. His Virginia regiment fought alongside troops from Pennsylvania and South Carolina, marking one of the first times colonial forces from different regions had united under a single command. The significance of this cooperation would not be fully realized until years later, when these same colonies would need to stand together against a common enemy. The French commander, Ensign Joseph Callan de Villiers de Jumonville, had been sent with a small diplomatic mission to warn the British away from French territory. But Washington, acting on intelligence that suggested hostile French intentions, ordered an attack on the French camp in the early morning hours of May 28, 1754. The brief skirmish resulted in Jumonville's death and the capture of most of his men, according to historical accounts documented in the Pennsylvania Gazette. Washington's actions were both praised and criticized by colonial leaders, who understood the gravity of attacking a diplomatic envoy. The young major had effectively fired the first shots of what would become known as the French and Indian War. Though he claimed the French had been preparing to attack his position, the French response was swift and decisive. Captain Louis Callan de Villiers, brother of the slain Jumonville, marched from Fort Duquesne with a force of 600 French soldiers and Canadian militia, accompanied by 100 Native American warriors. They surrounded Fort Necessity on July 3, 1754. Forcing Washington into his first major military defeat. The surrender terms signed that rainy July day would haunt Washington for years to come. Written in French, the document contained a clause admitting to the assassination of Jumonville, a word Washington claimed he had not understood. This diplomatic embarrassment would fuel French propaganda efforts and justify their expanded military operations in the Ohio Valley. As Washington's defeated force marched back to Virginia, few could have predicted that this seemingly minor frontier skirmish would escalate into a global conflict spanning 7 years. The young major's experience at Fort Necessity taught him valuable lessons about leadership, logistics, and the importance of understanding one's enemy, lessons that would prove invaluable in future conflicts. The aftermath of Fort Necessity revealed the colony's desperate need for coordinated defense. Individual colonial militias, operating without central command or standardized equipment, had proven inadequate against the well-organized French forces and their Native American allies. This realization would spark the first serious discussions about intercolonial cooperation and shared military responsibilities. The disaster at Fort Necessity sent shockwaves through the colonial capitals from Boston to Charleston. In the drawing rooms of Philadelphia and the coffee houses of New York, its colonial leaders grappled with an uncomfortable truth. They were woefully unprepared for the conflict that was rapidly approaching their doorsteps. Benjamin Franklin, most prominent citizen, had long advocated for greater cooperation between the colonies. The French threat provided him with the perfect opportunity to advance his vision of colonial unity. In June 1754, just days before Washington's defeat, Franklin published his famous "Join or Die" cartoon in the Pennsylvania Gazette. The image of a segmented snake, with each piece representing a different colony, would become one of the most powerful symbols of American unity. the British government, alarmed by reports from the frontier, ordered the colonial governors to meet in Albany, New York, to discuss defensive measures and negotiate with the Iroquois Confederacy. The Albany Congress, convening in June 1754, brought together delegates from 7 colonies: New York, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New Hampshire. The Iroquois, led by Chief Hendrick of the Mohawks, arrived in Albany with grave concerns about British resolve. For generations, the 6 nations had maintained a delicate balance between French and British interests. But the recent French expansion threatened to upset this equilibrium. Chief Hendrick's eloquent speeches to the assembled delegates carried an unmistakable message: the British colonies must unite or face certain defeat. Franklin seized upon this moment to present his plan of union, a comprehensive proposal for colonial confederation. His plan called for a Grand Council composed of representatives from each colony, led by a President General appointed by the Crown. This governing body would have the power to raise armies, build fortifications, regulate Indian trade, and levy taxes to fund common defense. The debates in Albany revealed the deep divisions that existed between the colonies. Virginia's delegates worried about losing control of their western land claims, while Massachusetts representatives feared that smaller colonies would have disproportionate influence in the proposed union. New York's delegates, hosting the Congress in their own city, expressed concerns about the financial burden of maintaining a continental army. Despite these disagreements, the delegates ultimately approved Franklin's plan on July 10, 1754. The vote represented a remarkable achievement in colonial cooperation, demonstrating that American leaders could overcome their differences when faced with a common threat. However, the plan's ultimate failure would prove even more significant than its temporary success. When the Albany Plan was submitted to the individual colonial assemblies for ratification, it met with universal rejection. The Massachusetts General Court worried about taxation without representation, while Virginia's House of Burgesses refused to surrender control over Western territories. Pennsylvania's Assembly, despite Franklin's leadership, rejected the plan. As too radical a departure from traditional colonial governance, the British government also rejected the Albany Plan, viewing it as a dangerous step toward colonial independence. Officials in London preferred to maintain direct control over colonial defense, rather than empowering an American confederation. That might eventually challenge royal authority. Yet, the Albany Congress had accomplished something unprecedented in colonial history. For the first time, representatives from multiple colonies had gathered to discuss common interests and shared challenges. The relationships formed during those summer weeks in Albany would prove crucial in the years to come, as the same men who had debated Franklin's plan would later lead their colonies through the French and Indian War. The failure of the Albany Plan also revealed the fundamental tension that would define colonial British relations for the next 2 decades. The colonies desired greater autonomy and the right to manage their own affairs, while the British government insisted on maintaining centralized control. This conflict would simmer beneath the surface throughout the French and Indian War, eventually erupting into open rebellion 20 years later. As the delegates departed Albany in July 1754, they carried with them a new understanding of both the possibilities and limitations of colonial cooperation. The French and Indian War would test these lessons in the crucible of combat, forging bonds between the colonies that would ultimately prove stronger than their ties to Britain. The spring of 1755 brought renewed British determination to drive the French from North America. Major General Edward Braddock, a veteran of European campaigns, arrived in Virginia with 2 regiments of regular troops in orders to capture Fort Duquesne. His mission represented the most ambitious British military operation in colonial America. To that date, Braddock's army was a marvel of military engineering and organization. Nearly 1,500 British regulars, resplendent in their red coats and polished brass buttons, marched alongside colonial militia units from Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Maryland. The expedition's baggage train stretched for miles, carrying heavy artillery pieces, tons of ammunition, and supplies for a prolonged siege. George Washington, now serving as a volunteer aide-de-camp to Braddock, watched with fascination as the British general applied European military doctrine to the American wilderness. The young Virginian had learned hard lessons from his defeat at Fort Necessity, but he worried that Braddock's rigid adherence to conventional tactics might prove disastrous in the dense forests of Pennsylvania. The road to Fort Duquesne became an epic of colonial cooperation and engineering. Men from different colonies worked side by side, cutting through mountains and bridging streams to create a highway suitable for artillery and supply wagons. This massive undertaking required unprecedented coordination between colonial governments, each of which contributed men, materials, showed, and funding to the common cause. Benjamin Franklin played a crucial role in supporting Braddock's expedition. Using his influence in Pennsylvania to secure wagons and supplies for the British Army, his efforts demonstrated the growing willingness of colonial leaders to support imperial military objectives. Even when those objectives conflicted with local interests, the march westward took on an almost ceremonial quality as the army passed. Through colonial settlements, farmers and townspeople gathered along the route to witness the largest military force ever assembled in North America. For many colonists, particularly those living on the frontier, Braddock's expedition represented hope for security and protection from French and Indian raids. However, the expedition's slow progress began to worry Washington and other colonial officers familiar with frontier warfare. The Army's methodical advance, limited by its heavy baggage train and artillery, allowed French scouts to track their movements and prepare defensive positions. Native American allies of the French launched hit-and-run attacks on the Army's flanks, creating a constant state of tension and uncertainty. On July 9, 1755, Braddock's force encountered a combined French and Indian army near the Monongahela River, just 8 miles from Fort Duquesne. The Battle of the Monongahela began as a conventional European engagement, with both sides forming neat lines of battle in a forest clearing. Within minutes, however, the encounter devolved into chaos as French and Indian warriors surrounded the British force and subjected them to devastating flanking fire. The British regulars, trained for European battlefields, found themselves helpless against an enemy that refused to fight in formation. Officers on horseback presented easy targets for hidden marksmen, while tightly packed infantry companies suffered horrific casualties from crossfire. The famous redcoats that had struck fear into enemies across Europe now made British soldiers conspicuous targets in the green shadows of the Pennsylvania forest. Washington watched in horror as the army disintegrated around him. 2 horses were shot from under him, and 4 musket balls tore through his coat, yet he survived the carnage that claimed nearly 1,000 British and colonial lives. General Braddock, mortally wounded while trying to rally his men, died 4 days later, but not before entrusting his papers to the young Virginian. The retreat from the Monongahela became a rout as surviving soldiers abandoned their weapons, supplies, and wounded comrades in their desperate flight eastward. The magnificent army that had inspired such confidence just days earlier now straggled back to Virginia as a broken, demoralized remnant. News of Braddock's defeat sent shockwaves through the colonies. The invincible British army had been destroyed by a force barely one-third its size, demonstrating that European military superiority meant nothing in the American wilderness. Colonial newspapers, including references found in the Virginia Gazette, reported the disaster with a mixture of sorrow and alarm, recognizing that the frontier now lay open to French and Indian attack. The defeat also marked a turning point in colonial military thinking. The disaster proved that conventional European tactics were inadequate for American warfare, and that colonial forces, familiar with frontier conditions, might be more effective than regular troops in certain situations. This realization would prove crucial in the years to come, as the colonies developed their own military traditions and tactical doctrines. The years following, Braddock's defeat brought a series of military disasters that left the British colonies reeling. Fort Oswego fell to the French in 1756, followed by the devastating loss of Fort William Henry in 1757. The massacre of British prisoners after the fort's surrender sent waves of terror through colonial settlements, while French and Indian raiding parties struck deep into Pennsylvania, Virginia, and the Carolinas. In London, the Duke of Newcastle's government struggled to comprehend the magnitude of the American crisis. The loss of 3 major forts and thousands of troops had shattered British prestige throughout North America, while the Royal Navy's inability to prevent French reinforcements from reaching Canada exposed fundamental weaknesses in imperial strategy. Transformation of British fortunes began with the rise of William Pitt the Elder, who became Secretary of State for the Southern Department in 1757. Pitt brought to the war effort a global vision that recognized America's strategic importance and the need for unprecedented cooperation with colonial forces. His energy and determination would reshape not only British strategy, but also the relationship between Britain and her American colonies. Pitt's first major decision was to subsidize colonial military efforts on an unprecedented scale. Unlike previous administrations that had demanded colonial assemblies fund their own defense, Pitt promised to reimburse the colonies for their military expenses. This policy encouraged colonial governments to raise larger armies and maintain them in the field for extended campaigns. The Secretary's second crucial innovation was his willingness to work with colonial officers and incorporate their expertise into British planning. Rather than dismissing colonial military knowledge as inferior, Pitt recognized that Americans understood frontier warfare better than European-trained officers. This collaboration would prove essential to British success in the challenging terrain of North America. Massachusetts responded to Pitt's initiatives with enthusiasm, raising 7,000 troops for the 1758 campaign. Connecticut contributed 5,000 men, while New York and Pennsylvania each provided substantial forces. For the first time in the war, the colonies were contributing more troops than Britain herself, demonstrating their growing military capacity and commitment to the imperial cause. The first test of Pitt's new strategy came with the siege of Louisbourg in 1758. The fortress, guarding the mouth of the St. Lawrence River, represented the key to French Canada. General Geoffrey Amherst commanded the expedition, supported by a fleet under Admiral Edward Boscawen and a substantial force of colonial troops. Siege demonstrated the effectiveness of Anglo-American cooperation under Pitt's leadership. British regular troops provided the technical expertise for siege warfare, while colonial forces contributed their knowledge of American conditions and their proven fighting ability. The fortress surrendered on July 26, 1758, opening the sea route to Quebec and marking the beginning of French collapse in North America. Simultaneously, British and colonial forces launched a multi-pronged assault on French positions throughout the continent. Lieutenant Colonel John Bradstreet led a combined British colonial force that captured Fort Frontenac on Lake Ontario, severing French communications with their western posts. General John Forbes, learning from Braddock's mistakes, slowly advanced on Fort Duquesne with a force heavily composed of colonial troops. The capture of Fort Duquesne in November 1758 marked a symbolic turning point in the war. The French, facing overwhelming odds and cut off from reinforcements, abandoned the fort that had been the source of so much trouble for the British colonies. Forbes renamed it Fort Pitt, honoring the minister whose policies had made victory possible. These victories demonstrated the effectiveness of colonial military forces when properly supported and coordinated. Pennsylvania and Virginia troops, fighting on familiar ground with adequate supplies and clear objectives, proved themselves equal to any European soldiers. The success of colonial forces in 1758 helped establish their reputation for military competence and reliability. The transformation of the war effort also strengthened bonds between different colonial communities. Soldiers from Massachusetts served alongside Virginians, while Pennsylvania and New York troops learned to work together in joint operations. These shared experiences created personal relationships and mutual respect that transcended colonial boundaries. Pitt's policies had succeeded in mobilizing colonial resources and energy for the imperial cause, but they had also demonstrated colonial military capacity and fostered a sense of shared identity among American troops. The victories of 1758 marked not only the beginning of French defeat, but also the emergence of a distinctly American military tradition that would have profound implications for the future. The campaign of 1759 opened with British forces poised to deliver the decisive blow against New France. William Pitt's strategy called for a three-pronged assault on the remaining French strongholds. General Geoffrey Amherst would advance north from Lake Champlain toward Montreal, while General John Prideaux would attack Fort Niagara to sever French communications with the Western Territories. The most ambitious and dangerous operation would be General James Wolfe's assault on Quebec, the capital of French Canada. The coordination required for these simultaneous operations represented the pinnacle of Anglo-American military cooperation. Colonial assemblies had raised over 20,000 troops for the campaign, more than double the number of British regulars participating in the offensive. These colonial forces brought not only manpower, but also invaluable knowledge of American geography, weather patterns, and supply requirements. Wolfe's expedition up the St. Lawrence River captured the imagination of colonists throughout North America. The young general, barely 32 years old, had earned fame at Louisbourg and was known for his willingness to share hardships with his soldiers. His force of 9,000 men included significant numbers of colonial troops, particularly rangers from New Hampshire and Massachusetts, who would prove crucial in the coming campaign. The Siege of Quebec began in June 1759 with a massive bombardment that reduced much of the lower city to ruins. However, the French commander, the Marquis de Montcalm, had positioned his forces on the seemingly impregnable plains of Abraham, protected by steep cliffs and the city's stone walls. Wolfe's initial attempts to storm the French positions failed with heavy casualties. Leading to growing concern about the expedition's ultimate success, colonial troops distinguished themselves during the siege through their adaptability and innovative tactics. New England Rangers, led by Major Robert Rogers, conducted reconnaissance missions that provided crucial intelligence about French positions and supply lines. Pennsylvania and Virginia sharpshooters, fighting from concealed positions, inflicted significant casualties on French defenders while remaining relatively safe from return fire. The breakthrough came on September 13, 1759, when Wolfe discovered a narrow path leading up the cliffs west of Quebec. In one of the most daring operations of the 18th century, British and colonial forces scaled the heights under cover of darkness, emerging onto the plains of Abraham at dawn. The surprise was complete, forcing Montcalm to abandon his defensive positions and fight a conventional European-style battle. The Battle of the Plains of Abraham lasted less than an hour, but its consequences would reshape the map of North America. Both commanding generals were mortally wounded in the fighting, but British discipline and firepower proved decisive. The French army broke and fled, leaving Quebec defenseless. The city surrendered on September 18, 1759. Effectively ending French rule in North America, the fall of Quebec sent waves of celebration through the British colonies. Church bells rang from Boston to Charleston, while colonial newspapers proclaimed the victory as a triumph of British arms and colonial determination. According to reports in the Boston Gazette, victory was seen as vindication of colonial military contributions and proof that Americans could fight as effectively as a victory. The final French resistance collapsed quickly after Quebec's fall. Montreal surrendered to General Amherst in September 1760, while the last French forces in the Great Lakes region abandoned their posts rather than face certain defeat. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1763, formally transferred all of New France to British control, fulfilling the wildest dreams of colonial expanses. The conquest of Canada had profound implications for the relationship between Britain and her American colonies. Colonial forces had played a crucial role in the victory, contributing more troops than Britain herself and demonstrating their military competence on a continental scale. The shared experience of the war had created bonds between men from different colonies that transcended traditional regional boundaries. Veterans of the French and Indian War returned to their homes with new perspectives on their capabilities and their place in the British Empire. They had fought alongside British regulars as equals, commanded by officers who respected their abilities and valued their contributions. The experience had given them confidence in their own military traditions and skepticism about the superiority of European methods. The war had also demonstrated the effectiveness of intercolonial cooperation when faced with common challenges. The colonial assemblies had worked together to raise troops, supply armies, and coordinate strategy in ways that would have been impossible before the conflict. These precedents would prove crucial when the colonies faced new challenges from their own government in London. The transformation of British North America from a collection of isolated settlements into a unified continental power had been achieved through colonial cooperation and shared sacrifice. The French and Indian War had forged bonds between the WWII, the war's bonds between the colonies that were stronger than many participants realized, creating the foundation for future resistance to British policies that threatened colonial rights and interests. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 marked the end of French power in North America, but for the colonial veterans returning to their homes. The war's most lasting legacy was not territorial, but social. The men who had fought together at Louisbourg, Quebec, and Fort Duquesne carried with them memories of shared hardship and mutual respect that transcended the boundaries of their individual colonies. In the taverns of Boston and Philadelphia, in the churches of Virginia, and the town squares of Connecticut, veterans gathered to share stories of their service. A Massachusetts farmer might recount his experiences alongside Pennsylvania riflemen, while a Virginia planter described the courage of New York Rangers during a desperate night assault. These conversations multiplied across thousands of communities, created a new sense of American identity that had not existed before the war. The military experience had taught colonists that they could accomplish remarkable things when they worked together. The massive logistical effort required to supply armies in the wilderness had forced colonial governments to coordinate their activities in unprecedented ways. Pennsylvania's wagon trains had carried supplies for Massachusetts troops, while Virginia's tobacco revenues had helped fund Connecticut's military contributions. George Washington, now a seasoned veteran at 27, embodied this transformation. His service with British regulars had taught him European military science, while his experience commanding colonial troops had shown him the unique strengths of American soldiers. The young Virginian had earned the respect of officers from throughout the colonies, creating a network of relationships that would prove crucial in future conflicts. The war had also created a new class of colonial leaders who understood the continent's strategic importance and possessed the military experience to defend it. Men like Israel Putnam of Connecticut, Daniel Morgan of Virginia, and John Stark of New Hampshire had proven their courage and competence in battles across North America. Their reputations extended far beyond their home colonies, making them truly continental figures. The financial cooperation required by the war effort had created economic bonds between the colonies that persisted after the peace. Merchants who had supplied armies during the conflict continued to trade with partners in other colonies, creating commercial networks that linked American communities from Georgia to New Hampshire. These economic relationships provided a foundation for political cooperation that would prove essential in the years to come. The French and Indian War had also demonstrated the colonies' capacity for self-governance and military organization. Colonial assemblies had raised and equipped armies, negotiated with Indian tribes, and coordinated complex military campaigns with remarkable efficiency. The experience had given colonial leaders confidence in their ability to manage their own affairs without constant oversight from London. Religious cooperation during the war had strengthened bonds between different colonial communities. Presbyterian ministers from Pennsylvania had served alongside Congregationalist chaplains from Massachusetts, while Anglican priests from Virginia had worked with Dutch Reformed pastors from New York. These interfaith collaborations had broken down barriers between different colonial religious traditions. The shared experience of fighting against a common enemy had created a mythology of American military prowess that would influence colonial thinking for generations. Stories of colonial rangers outfighting French regulars, of American riflemen picking off enemy officers at impossible distances, and of colonial militiamen standing firm against bayonet charges became part of American folklore. The war's end brought recognition from British authorities that colonial contributions had been essential to victory. William Pitt's policies of reimbursing colonial military expenses and promoting colonial officers had demonstrated metropolitan respect for American capabilities. This recognition encouraged colonists to view themselves as equal partners in the British Empire rather than subordinate dependencies, however. War had also revealed tensions between imperial and colonial interests that would prove difficult to resolve. The Albany Plan's failure had demonstrated the fundamental disagreement between London and America about the proper relationship between central authority and local autonomy. The success of colonial military forces had given Americans confidence in their ability to defend their own interests, even against imperial opposition. The bonds forged during the French and Indian War would be tested sooner than anyone expected. Within 2 years of the Treaty of Paris, the British government would begin implementing new policies designed to extract revenue from the colonies and strengthen imperial control over American affairs. The colonists' response to these policies would be shaped by their wartime experiences and the relationships they had formed during 7 years of common struggle. The victory celebration in New York City on October 7, 1763, perfectly captured the transformation that had occurred in British North America. Representatives from every colony gathered to commemorate the Treaty of Paris. But the men who raised their glasses in toast that autumn evening were fundamentally different from those who had met in Albany 9 years earlier, the French and Indian. War had created something unprecedented in colonial history. A generation of American leaders who thought in continental terms. These men had commanded troops from multiple colonies, negotiated with Indian tribes across vast territories, coordinated military campaigns that spanned the entire continent. Their perspective had been enlarged by experience, and their confidence had been strengthened by success. Benjamin Franklin is now recognized as one of the most influential men in America, exemplified this transformation. His role in supporting Braddock's expedition had demonstrated the importance of intercolonial cooperation, while his diplomatic missions to London had given him insights into imperial policymaking. Franklin's vision of American potential had been vindicated by the war's outcome. But he had also learned disturbing lessons about British attitudes toward colonial autonomy. The military lessons of the war would prove even more significant than its political consequences. Colonial forces had demonstrated their ability to fight effectively in North American conditions, often outperforming British regulars in wilderness campaigns. The experience had created a cadre of skilled officers who understood both European military science and American tactical innovations. The war had also revealed the inadequacy of traditional European military doctrine when applied to American conditions. British regulars, magnificent on European battlefields, had proven vulnerable to frontier warfare tactics employed by French and Indian forces. Colonial troops, fighting with flexible formations and emphasizing marksmanship over volley fire, had often achieved better results than their European counterparts. These military innovations would have profound implications for future conflicts. The Rangers developed by Robert Rogers, the riflemen trained in Pennsylvania and Virginia, and the light infantry tactics pioneered by colonial forces represented a distinctly American approach to warfare. This military tradition, forged in the forests of North America, would prove crucial when the colonies faced new challenges from their own government. The economic legacy of the war was equally significant. The massive expenditures required to fund colonial military efforts had created unprecedented cooperation between colonial assemblies and demonstrated their capacity to mobilize resources for common objectives. The experience had also revealed the colonies' growing economic strength and their ability to sustain large-scale military operations. However, the war's financial costs had also created new tensions between Britain and America. The British government, facing enormous debts from the global conflict, began to view the colonies as a source of revenue rather than a drain on imperial resources. This shift in perspective would lead to policies that directly challenged the autonomy that colonists had come to expect. The Proclamation of 1763, which prohibited colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains, was the first sign of changing imperial attitudes. The very territories that colonists had fought to secure were now declared off-limits by the government in London. This policy seemed to negate the sacrifices made during the war and suggested that British and American interests were beginning to diverge. The relationships forged during the French and Indian War would provide the foundation for colonial resistance to British policies in the years to come. When the Stamp Act crisis erupted in 1765, colonial leaders drew upon networks of cooperation that had been established during the war. The same men who had coordinated military campaigns now organized economic boycotts and political protests. The committees of correspondence that would become crucial to colonial resistance were modeled on the communication networks that had been essential to wartime cooperation. The experience of coordinating military activities across vast distances had taught colonists the importance of maintaining regular communication and shared intelligence. Perhaps most importantly, the French and Indian War had created a sense of American identity that transcended colonial boundaries. The men who had fought together at Ticonderoga in Quebec, who had shared the hardships of winter campaigns and the exhilaration of victory, developed loyalties that extended beyond their individual colonies to embrace the entire continent. When the First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia in 1774, many of the delegates were veterans of the French and Indian War who had fought together 30 years earlier. Their wartime experiences had taught them the value of cooperation and given them confidence in their ability to resist imperial oppression. The French and Indian War had accomplished what the Albany Plan of Union could not. It had created practical bonds between the colonies that were stronger than any formal political arrangement. The shared experience of 7 years of warfare had forged a common cause that would survive the transition from imperial cooperation to revolutionary resistance. The ultimate irony of the French and Indian War was that Britain's greatest military victory in North America had created the conditions for her greatest defeat. The war had strengthened the colonies, unified their leadership, and given them the military experience and confidence needed to challenge imperial authority. The bonds forged in the service of empire would ultimately be turned against it, as the colonies that had united to defeat France would unite again to achieve their independence from Britain. In the end, the French and Indian War had accomplished more than the conquest of Canada. It had created the foundation for American nationhood. The common cause that had emerged from 7 years of shared struggle would prove strong enough to sustain the colonies through an even greater test: the creation of an independent nation that would embody the ideals of unity and self-governance that had been born in the forests of colonial America.